Hi there and welcome to the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Namfuri. And on tonight's show, I want us to explore three key issues which our production team have tabled for you, our viewers. First one has got to do with the Ghana Cedi, and over the past few weeks, we've broken news of some depreciation in the Ghana Cedi. Tonight, I'll show you a graph that looks at a 5-year period of the Ghana Cedi. This graph in itself is very informative, it's very telling, and we'll have a discussion around that briefly, and we'll move on to look at the country's debt and what we can learn from there, whether the composition of our debt is changing, and by composition I mean who are we borrowing from the more, how will it affect us, and stuff like that. Then we'll look at the election year 2020 and see what we should expect from the business community, the investing community. Normally we hear of investors are very wary, or investors are very wary when it comes to the election year. Is that fact or fiction? We want to explore tonight, and we'll be delving with this. But I need to introduce my guests to you, two astute gentlemen. I've been told I like using the word astute a lot, but anyway, the gentlemen are indeed astute. I have with me Michael Kobler. He's the country director for Cedi Ghana, and I have with me our friend Professor Bokpin, economist, and he's the University of Ghana Business School. So we'll be delving into the issues, and like I said earlier on, the krinkum krankum of all these economic issues. We'll look at it tonight. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Right, you're welcome back from the quick break we just had. Let me start off with the infograph we prepared for you, and this is a snapshot of data we picked from the Bloomberg terminal, and credits to my colleague Norvan Akwa-Hayford for getting this for us. And as you can see, over a 5-year period, starting in 2014, right down to just about the end of November 2019, and you see where the Ghana Cedi started. If you look at the top left corner, at the top there, you see from 2014, just around December, you see the Ghana Cedi, for lack of a better word, let's just use depreciating. And it's been coming down all the way. Our Cedi has been losing value in comparison with other currencies in the world. Particularly, we use the US dollar for easy comparison. So when you hear George Raffray talking about the Cedi has depreciated vis-a-vis the US dollar, this is how it looks like in a picture when you look at the value of the Ghana Cedi over a 5-year period. We started somewhere in 2014, I think just around 3 point something, and today we are doing more than 5.6 Ghana Cedis to a US dollar. Some would say we've discussed this every year. We know the solutions to this problem. What then can we do? So I want to come to Prof. Bokpin first. And Prof, I for one have been told by some of our viewers and listeners that we've discussed this Cedi issue over and over again. We know what the solution is. We know what we need to do to bring in more foreign exchange, what we need to do to cut our use of foreign exchange. So are these myopic lenses through which we're looking at this discussion, or there's something more we need to learn about the Ghana Cedi and its relationship with other foreign currencies?
I'm not too sure there's anything more we need to talk about, or there's any additional point we have to make. Perhaps the reason why there's very little incentive to revise the lecture notes, because the things we were told to do in the 80s, diversification, diversify your economy, do more exports, increase local content. If we had done them, we wouldn't be in this situation. So really, it's more about getting to work. It's not so much about getting new ideas. Unless you want to be extremely traditionalist, where we consider something new as long as it's the same old one. But that is where we find ourselves now. It's more of lack of action. Lack of action more in terms of the fact that we have not been able to talk our walk and walk our talk over the years, and it's catching up with us. So in terms of diversifying the economy, we have not been able to do so. We have also not been able to increase local content in our economy. Our economy is In fact, our GDP is driven by just about some 55 institutional units, more or less. Less than 5% of that are Ghanaian owned. And I will show you where this is coming from. So from the 10th of 2017, Ghana has recorded a trade surplus. Okay, when you look at purely import-export balance, okay, so we have seen trade surplus. Theoretically, that should contribute to the strengthening of the local currency, but that hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is to look at the other component of the balance of payment when it comes to income and then services and income, where we are recording huge outflows, which tends to dwarf the gains from the other side. And it's likely because of the profit repatriation, the excessive dominance of foreign activities in our economy. So towards the end of the year, running to the first quarter of the year, the Cedi usually comes under cumulative pressure. And it's also a reflection of corporate activity, profit transfer. And even when you look at, and then also when you look at the debt management strategy we have, as a country, we have implemented from 2015. So it worked in the present value, but it's a recipe for disaster now because and that is what has translated to maybe in terms of the debt structure now. So in the time past, we did some Cedi issue, and we opened it up to foreign investors. So we killed two birds with one stone. We got the money. It's also show up our international reserves, but there's an exit point. Okay, and the exit point is what is showing now, and the foreign exchange market is very, very shallow. So, and because of the 2020 election, which started a couple of years ago, it's not starting next year. You understand that? And with the increasing level of negative news onto the market, it's already influencing investor decisions, even on the secondary market, in terms of those who are seeking early redemption of their investment in Ghana. And even though they are Cedi denominated, when they are exiting, they will be looking for dollars. Because the Cedi can only go as far as the Togo border. So these are the realities on the ground.
Mike, I saw you nodding your head as Prof was making submissions. You have played in this space for quite a long time. This whole investor sentiment and opening up our domestic markets to foreign investors. I was doing some checks some time ago, somewhere in August, and I think data from Central Securities Depository. When I looked at all the data for debt holdings, I saw that foreign investors had about, if I'm not mistaken, between 35 to 45% of our domestic debt holdings. Yeah. We are a country that's looking to develop, obviously. We need this type of funding because our domestic market is hasn't really expanded yet. Let me just say that. What then can we do in such a situation to balance the needs of our economy in one hand, and at the same time cut back on the problems that Prof has just enumerated, the exit points that come in and then affect our Cedi? What can we do around such things?
I think it's about changing the profile of our debts portfolio. You cannot, I mean, we are a developing country, we need foreign investments, but it's also important to acknowledge that the profile of the debt that we attract has an implication on the short to medium term effect of the country. So if we issue long-term debt, for instance, in fixed instruments which are not necessarily tradable, I mean, there are countries that issue 30-year bonds, 50-year bonds, and they are not tradable. I mean, so there's no real immediate exit point. For those kind of activity, you don't expect those trigger points maybe during election years. But the way our debt profile is currently, by allowing foreign investors to come in the short term, once we have election, then there's uncertainty. I always tell people that investors don't like noise, and investors and investments is fungible. So depending on where investors believe that there is relative peace or there is relative stability, they'll move funds there. So around this time, next year we are going into an election year, you expect that investors, being very prudent, will start exiting at some point, and that's the trigger effect that we are beginning to see. Apart from all the points that Prof has alluded to in terms of not being able to walk our talk, we know how much rice we import into this country, and we made so much noise about growing rice. rice is grown, and yet we've not followed through the value chain. So yes, now the farmers will now go back and stop growing the rice because nobody is buying or they're not getting value for money. Okay, we don't have the silos that will warehouse this rice and give them value in the long term. So ultimately, we are trying to take the right steps, but we're not following through the value chain. So what happens then is that it's counterproductive. You have the production that has been done, nobody is buying, and then the farmers get frustrated, and then we go back to that same cycle again of imports. So once you start importing, your imports are more than your exports, you get into the cycle of your currency depreciating. I mean, so it's really not rocket science. I mean, I think that we know what to do. It's having the political will to do it and putting in the right structures to be able to ward off these effects.
Political will, they say, is the currency for development. We are talking about debts in this issue. I mean, all these things we're discussing are intertwined, and there's no way, even though we are breaking them down into bits, they all have a connection. And I want us to move into debt, and I want us to start first off with the infographics I prepared for you again. It shows the composition of our debt from, let me just put it, who we are borrowing from or who lends to us. So we have, in one hand, multilateral lenders. That's the World Bank, IMF, AFDB, etc. Then we have the bilateral lenders. So if you can see, the first infograph has got to do with the multilateral lenders. And you see from 2015 to 2018. In 2015, our exposure to multilateral lenders, like I mentioned, IMF, World Bank, AFDB, etc., is about $5.37 billion. We jumped up all the way to $6.45 billion in a period of about 3 years. So that's for multilateral. Let's move on to the next one that has got to do with bilateral. And you see, bilateral has got to do with mainly country-to-country lending. So, for example, if the UK gives us a loan through DFID, or the US gives us a loan through one of its agencies, or Japan gives us a loan through JICA, that is how much we are exposed to some of these lenders. So from 2015, we have 1.09 billion. We've gone up. You see, the quantum there is not quite huge. Yeah, so about 1.2 billion. So that's for bilateral lenders. Let's move on to the next one. The export credit agencies. How will I break this down? When you hear things like Exim Guarantee and stuff like that, those type of institutions, they come under these export credit agencies. And you can see also in there 1.17 billion, and then in 2015, we went up to 2018, 1.23 billion. So not much growth in there. You can even see that in 2017, we were at 1.46. We've come down to 1.23. And this is data from the Bank of Ghana's statistical bulletin for the fourth quarter. Then we go to the other concessional lenders. Concessional means soft lending, soft in terms of interest rates, repayment times, etc. We see there 1.81 billion in 2015. We've come down to 1.69 in 2018 billion. So you can see that we've taken a dip. So we're taking less from these other concessional lenders. Let's move on to the next one. That's got to do with commercial creditors. And commercial creditors, I would put in, for example, let's say international banks. So if Stanchart PLC wants to lend to us, HSBC, UBS, any of those foreign banks, those are commercial creditors. You can see in there that 2015, we were doing $2.7 billion. 2018, we've even come down to 2.3 billion. Let's move on to the next one. So this is where I want us to focus on, the international capital markets. And let's just call this the Eurobond borrowing for simplicity. 2015, 3.53 billion. And see the jump in there to 4.97 in 2018. And if you look at the data, and I'm sure, Mike, you'll agree with me, and I'll start with you here. The quantum in terms of multilateral, bilateral, they are still high in there. But the growth, we see the international capital markets coming in there. I was doing a bit of reading this week from Bloomberg, etc., and then some of the IMF blogs. And the theme last week has been debt. The IMF boss, Madame Gorgieva, was speaking to Bloomberg, and she was expressing concern about Africa's rising debt and how it poses challenges to us. And we've gone up to lower middle income, Prof. I don't know if it's upper middle or lower middle. I'm sure it's lower middle income country, middle income country at the lower end, which has cut back our access to some of these cheap lending. So
that
now we are
what
doing.
is showing in the
That's what is
graph
showing
that-
there. So Mike, now that we're doing a lot of this commercially or market-based borrowing or market-based lending, what should we be looking out for? Prof gave a presentation at Ghana Integrity Initiative's Multi-Stakeholder Business Integrity Initiative Forum, and he showed us that our exposure to the US dollar in terms of our debt is quite high as compared to other currencies. What should we be doing here for our stature as a country? And the question I want to ask both of you, did we jump to this lower middle income thing too quickly?
No, I don't think so. I think that as a country, we're over 50 years now, and we need to move forward. Debt in itself is not a bad thing.
Okay.
It's how you apply the debt. Are you applying the debt to recurring expenditure, or you're applying the debt to productive sectors where you mix? And we've been talking about the integration, the aluminum integrated industry. And we want to change that. I mean, turn out bauxite into alumina and export and all that. These borrowings that we are doing, where is it really going? I think that's the key issue. Because, you know, if you borrow $1 billion and you're able to invest and generate $3 billion, it's a no-brainer. I mean, you are not doing anything unethical, you're not doing anything untoward. Okay, so for the ordinary man on the street, I mean, it's not about the borrowing, and as we speak, because we are a middle-income country, the years of concessionary funding are over. Yeah. So we'll definitely have to borrow on commercial basis. And commercial borrowing is not cheap. Okay, so if commercial borrowing is expensive, how do you apply those borrowings? So it's a question of how we are applying the funds that we receive. Okay, are we putting it in productive sectors, or we are putting it into social sectors? I mean, obviously, if you borrow on commercial basis, you are doing hospitals, or you are doing roads, you are not tolling, and you are not getting immediate revenue for those things, it will have a toll on the economy. But if you are borrowing and putting it into productive sectors, it becomes a different ballgame, because then you'll be able to generate enough revenue to be able to service the loan and also to have other impact, social impact on the economy. So it's how you really how you disperse those loans in those productive sectors that matter. So, and if you look at debt sustainability ratio currently, it looks better than maybe the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, so yes, the IMF, the Bretton Woods institution will say you are borrowing too much, you are doing this, you are doing that. But we need to grow as a country.
Okay.
If you don't borrow, how do you grow? But then the question is, if you borrow, where do you put it? Are you putting it into sectors where you can have a multiplier effect in terms of getting additional revenue to shore up the other borrowings that you have, that you are using for less productive sectors like social sectors or social interventions? That is what we need to look at. Yeah.
Prof, Mike mentions the fact that you know what, when we take the borrowing, let's put it in productive sectors. Before I get your take on all this, as somebody that you've researched and presented on a multiplicity of these issues, first question I want to ask before you even give your take is, are we transparent with the spending of our borrowed funds? Because I, for one, sitting here, if you told me that what did the government of Ghana use proceeds from last 2 years Eurobond for, I will start and think, the first thing that will come to my mind is liability management. I always hear the finance minister talking about liability management.
It's 1 billion of that.
So we have borrowed
2 billion.
We have borrowed to take care of other borrowings.
That's what we have been doing. We've been doing that since independence.
So, so
there's no innovation in there.
The transparency
it's
issue.
rollover.
Yeah.
Prof, please go ahead.
Well, I agree 100%. So I'm going to look at it from another dimension, why the borrowing. So you want to grow. You can finance that from IGF. And for a country, the IGF will be maybe your tax revenue. That's what you have control over. Once you are not, how do you finance that growth? So once your IGF remains dwarfed, then it means that you have to go external. So external, in the time past, we have relied, like you said, multilateral, bilateral, and all of that. But the point is that if you're asking for that now, it's no longer available because we are not in that market anymore, because we are a lower middle-income country. I mean, so, and it was basically because of 2 rebasing we had done in the last 10 years. One we did in 2010, where we moved the base year from 1993 to 2006. And with that, the GDP expanded by more than 60%, and also in terms of the sectorial weight reclassification that we did. And then also we did another rebase in 2017, where we moved the base year again from 2006 to 2003. I mean, there's conventional wisdom in doing
2013.
Yes, to 2006 to 13.
Okay.
And GDP expanded by about 25%. Okay, that is fine. So, I mean, but the question is, how does this translate to revenue generation? So you realize that until the rebasing, our tax to GDP ratio was around 17.5%. Then after rebasing, it came down significantly. So it means that the emerging areas, we are unable to track the revenue generation from that, because there's a relationship between GDP growth and then revenue generation. And that is why oftentimes we will say that the most effective way to manage your debt is to grow your economy, especially from the angle Mike is talking about, that you went for the debt, you applied them in the productive sectors of the economy, then you would have enhanced your cash flow generation capacity, then to service the debt and to also retire the principal. But all these things have become a topical issue today because the GDP growth side has not responded the way it should relative to the growth in the public debt. And usually when you are looking at the debt sustainability from the fiscal approach, once the rate of debt accumulation is lower than the rate at which GDP is growing, there's no problem. But we haven't seen that. And we haven't seen revenue envelope responding. And don't forget that if you look at Ghana's history, from independence, the local community participated hugely in the development process in terms of expansion in education. The chiefs donated their land. The community donated their labor and all of that. But right now, we are not doing anything like that anymore. Everything now is hanged on the central government to deliver on all of these things, and yet from the same dwarf revenue envelope. Then you can look at the growth in wage bill from single spine. That has taken so much fiscal space. And really, that goes to fund consumption, essentially. Then you can look at, so the growth in the debt is also showing up in the growth in the interest payment. So we are really in a fix to some extent.
I need to ask this here quickly. And Prof, let me just take you before I come to Mike. We've heard that next year the finance minister, they'll embark on a road show. Yeah. They are going to issue.
It's almost like next month, right?
Yeah, up to 3 billion. 2 key things. What do you make of the timing of this, and what do you think of the possible pricing?
Well, I'm not too sure we have a choice. I think the timing, I agree with them. The earlier you do it, the better. The more closer it gets to 2020 election, the more investors are going to hold you to ransom. Okay. And you're going to pay higher rate. And it doesn't look like the fundamentals would improve significantly from between January and let's say doing it in August. Also, and if you observe very carefully in this country, the last 4 months of every competitive election year, nobody manages anything. So you don't want to get so close to that point, because there would have been so much negative news in the market that these things, and the point is that especially in the foreign exchange market, consistent with what Mike talked about, negative news exert greater volatility in the market compared to positive news of the same magnitude. So the more we spill out negative news, those investors don't have the benefit of a second opinion or so, and they are in our market not because of love. They are here because they love their capital, they love their return. So if there are alternatives and there's risk, even the risk may not crystallize, but they would want to exit quickly and all of that. So certainly I believe that it's something, I agree with the timing. In terms of the rate, I'm not too sure. It also depends on the strategy they are going to put in place, and in terms of the roadshow and the news that they are going to inject. And it's more also, it's not so much about trying to win over the investors necessarily, but it's about being truthful with them, that these are the issues, these are the strategy we've put in place, and I believe that it is possible we could get it at slightly lower, but the question is dollar denominated. Even if you get it at 8%, it's still very high.
Okay.
Because you are borrowing to fund growth, then the rate, the interest rate on the borrowing also has implication for productivity growth. Because it's
Mike, hold your horses for me. I'll take a quick commercial break. This is the business edition of PM Express. My guest, you just heard Professor Godfred Bokpin. He's an economist. He's in the University of Ghana Business School. And Michael Kobler, the dapper man in his glasses, country director of Cedi Ghana. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're still live on your JoyNews channel, and this is the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuri. Before we went to the break, Prof. Bokpin was taking us through a question I asked him as to what his expectations were with regards to the timing and the pricing of government's next Eurobond issuance, which from the budget speech we know is going to be up to $3 billion US. I'm going to pick my cobbler's brain on this and ask him, Mike, if you look around the world and you're a man that plays in this space, you see rates all over the world are quite low. Some are even in negative. Investors are looking for a place where they can get high. One would say, well, we stand to benefit and we have all the cards, so we can call the shots. But at the same time, we have an election year coming up. How do we, as a country, marry these two when it comes to particularly the pricing? I don't know your thoughts also on the timing of this, whether you think is right, like what Prof said, or otherwise.
Well, typically the election year, the first 6 months is the active period. If you are not able to engage or do anything meaningful within the first 6 months of the election year, you've lost it. So in terms of timing, I mean, the first quarter, early second quarter will be perfect timing. In terms of pricing, it will largely depend on our track record. I mean, you spoke about transparency in the last election. How have we deployed the funds that we borrowed in the last election, the $3 billion? What did we tell investors we were going to use the money for, and what have we used it for? You'll be surprised. I mean, we sit here in this country, but the investors out there know a lot more than what we do. And they follow and track these things to the letter. So you go on a typical roadshow, and I was privileged to be in the first and second roadshow in this country, and they ask you very niggling questions. I mean, very down to the detail, and you'll be surprised. They will expose your nakedness to you. I mean, if you had said anything in your prospectus which is not the truth, you'll be found out. I mean, these guys are very smart investors. They're very shrewd, and they engage different countries. So what I'll say is that all over Africa, elections bring some kinds of uncertainty because of the track record that we have. And we always say we'll stick to fiscal discipline. We don't. We will not overspend. We overblow the budget. Our deficits are high and all that. So investors will generally be wary of these sentiments. And then based on all the issues around the last borrowing and how it has been deployed, investors will take a decision on how to price the bond. Depending on how they also gauge how desperate you are in terms of how you need the money, they could put a premium on it because they know that you need the money, whatever it is, your head is to the wall, so they'll make sure that they get some kind of premium out of you. So the timing is okay. I mean, early second quarter is fine. In terms of pricing, it depends on also what goes on in the early part of next year. If there are other competing bonds on the market at the time that we are issuing, and those countries tend to be more attractive or more stable, those are all determining factors. But the reference point to be the rate that we got away with in the last borrowing. They say you are good at your last deal. So then that will be a secondary market, what is happening in the secondary market. So all those investors will use that to inform how they price the bond. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on to the next part, the election as a whole. I mean, we've discussed bits and pieces of it, and then its impact. Let me start with Prof. Bokpin here. So the argument is that 2020 is going to be different because of the law we have put in place to ensure that we remain within a cap. And if I remember from 2016, I think President Mahama had this tagline, "No Ababase," where he would do his shoulders and some stuff. I think it was to signify not going back. How then, as a country, will we not go back to that stage where we have this issue? And I think you have said this somewhere before, that the 3 years after every election year, apart from 2004, are years we used to just rework, clean up the mess. Then we come and we mess ourselves again, then we continue. Yeah. How do we ensure that, given this law we've passed, and some argue it's just a law, and implementation, as we discussed, is also a problem? What then do we do?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that when you look at since 1992, Ghana has never been prepared like this in terms of the fiscal regime going into an election year like 2020, in terms of the Public Financial Management Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the zero financing from the central bank, and then other, in terms of capping also the deficit at 5% and all of that. So I believe that these are selling points for the Ministry of Finance, even as they prepare to go for the roadshow, that 2020 will not be like any other year with the level of indiscipline because of ABC, and we are committed to keeping that. But of course, like you said, history is not on our side. Our own records do not suggest that we can be trusted that much. And this also, you can see it showing in a varying degree of lack of credibility in terms of budget implementation in an election year, in terms of what we said we would do and what we actually did. In terms of targets that were exceeded, hugely exceeded. You can talk about 2,000, both in terms of even mostly macro targets, inflation, deficit, and all those things. We mixed them with, and the variations were very high. Then you can compare that. You can look at, with the exception of 2004, you can look at 2008, you can look at 2012, and it was actually the election excesses of 2012 that provided the basics for the just ended IMF program. Because when we ran a deficit in excess of 12% of GDP, and then remember 2012 election lasted for more than 8 hours. It took us a while. We said over 10 million people voted, and counting was a problem. Eventually let 9 people vote at the Supreme Court, and it took us a while. Okay, and if you look at the rate of growth in our debt stock from 2013 and then 2014, it was very huge. But of course, the energy crisis also peaked around that time. So all these things didn't help us to actually shake off the election excesses the way we used to. And so Ghana really never recovered from the election excesses of 2012, and then we went to 2016 and added to that. And if you look at even the 2020 budget, we are still talking about arrears you can trace back to all of that. So I'm just hoping that government would use next year to demonstrate that we have grown, we have matured, we have learned from our own past, so that we are able to, because everybody is talking about maintaining fiscal discipline. Because, and we all do know, and when we congratulate government today, it isn't out of proportion, because if you look at the numbers, we have made some gains in terms of the macro environment, in terms of reducing the deficit, where inflation has come to, and most of those macro variables are heading in the right direction. So the question is, how do we consolidate this? And how do we use next year to be able to consolidate these gains, so that we don't suffer a relapse, as so to speak, like we have seen in the time past. And it's a challenge. And if you observe carefully, you realize that in an election year, there are some expenditures that usually do not happen except in an election year, like funding the election itself. Okay, so all that is loaded onto the budget for that particular year. Then also you observe that from 1992, in all the major competitive elections, we are not that effective in revenue collection because we believe that it could translate to negative sentiment and it could affect the party in power. So the revenue envelope also doesn't. And even off election years, the revenue envelope has failed to respond the way we expect in terms of the various tax measures and policies, restructuring that have gone on in the last couple of years. So next year is a test case for all of us, particularly so because if we are saying that the public sector cannot be an important revenue employment generation handle and it's the private sector, then we have to use next year to show love to the private sector by maintaining fiscal discipline, building upon the gains that we have made at the macro level, because it takes a while for macro gains to translate to micro, because there's supposed to be a link actually, but we have not been able to move beyond macroeconomic stability since 1992, because in between elections we maintain macroeconomic stability and then we use the election to destroy all of that. So I believe that going forward what we have to do is to, but then again you also look at that, but there are several actors when it comes to an election year. In election year, the government in power rules, the party also rules, because the party is also moved into GN, and it's a whole lot of things. Then government is also vulnerable in an election year. So you realize that demand for things also increased, and it's not so difficult for the politician to say, okay, let's go, because they are going to load it onto the desktop. But mine, well, let's give government the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Because we have strengthened the legal framework. There's greater transparency today, unlike a couple of years ago, especially starting from 2015, as part of the IMF program in terms of the structural reforms from Public Financial Management Act. So when you look at it from 2016, 2017, 2018, there's greater transparency in terms of even how our borrowings are utilized. So when you read the debt management report that the Ministry of Finance sends to Parliament, there's a lot of information now about the borrowings and how the borrowings were applied, even in terms of the liability management and all of that.
Okay.
And then, so with the exception of the energy sector and then the financial sector cleanup, you would have seen that the debt stock really wouldn't have been where it is now. So even though we are talking about fiscal deficit, which is less than 5%, when you add the energy sector and you add the financial sector, our fiscal deficit is a little above 7%. And once it's above 7% and your GDP growth is lower than that, then you cannot achieve debt sustainability.
Good one, Prof. Mike, sentiment is a word used a lot in your business. And looking at investors, we've discussed bond investors, for example, and how they are exiting our market. We have had elections, and let me just limit myself to the Fourth Republic because of my age. But we've had elections every 4 years, and there has been no bloodshed, nothing. I mean, the little issues, but everything has been relatively calm. Why are these investors that we've discussed already, why are they exiting our market? Some of them, because we've heard, and I'm sure you'll agree. And even we've brought news that said some of these investors are getting out. That's why the city is depreciating. But we've shown that we can have elections and no blood will be spilled. So why? What's their sentiment? Why are they still exiting our market?
Well, it goes beyond bloodshed.
And it doesn't have to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
They said it's not the actual thing that worries them, but it's a fear of it that paralyzes them.
Exactly. So it's our perception.
Okay.
Perception is everything. I mean, and perception, not perception about bloodshed, but perception about the country not being able to pay its debts.
Okay.
Perception about the country not being able to generate enough revenue to take care of the investors, the obligations that they have for investors. If it's just like putting your money in treasury bill or putting your money in Pirel. Okay, I mean those are two extremes, but yes, that's how investors perceive it.
Okay.
investors look at a country, they look at it as various countries, look at it at various portfolios. Okay, so if they perceive that if they put money in Rwanda, for instance, I mean, there's not too much noise in Rwanda. Everybody thinks that Rwanda is getting their act right, and they are taking the right policies. They are making it the United States of Africa, or whatever, and that is, they can get their money right. It's easy. They're just going to put their money there. It's because people don't want any issues.
Yeah.
You know, investors, you know, the banking sector, people who work in a bank are very cautious. How do they lend their money? They want to get their money back. And in banking, there is something called the 3 C's: character, character, character. Same thing applies to international investors. So they say, what's the perception about this country? If there's a negative perception and there's so much noise about it, why bother? So then let's take our money to the place where there's not too much noise, and we can put our money there and get our money back. So yes, you've not shed any blood in the last couple of years. You've had very transparent elections. You've even gone to the Supreme Court
yes,
to pass judgment on the verdict of an election and all that. But beyond that, don't forget that in the process of doing all that, like Prof said, we waste time. We don't do anything. The country generally grinds to a halt. There's no productive sector. So people then want to wonder, how are these people going to be able to generate enough revenue to pay for the debts? Okay. Beyond that, I mean, we put a lot of burden on our government. I mean, in terms of central government financing everything. Yeah. You go to a country like Zimbabwe, the municipal authorities are self-financing. They raise money, I mean, through the issue of bonds, municipal bonds, to finance, I mean, take care of their streets, take care of their sewage, take care of whatever water supply and everything. And they are self-sustaining and self-financing. Yeah. In Ghana, everything has to be the central government. Okay. I mean, look at all these properties that we have dotted around, all these estates in Accra, cantonments,
enjoying state protection
and everything. Okay. How much property taxes are people paying? Okay. Look at all these people selling the market, the informal sector. People are not paying taxes. Okay. And it's the same formal sector that is taxed heavily. Okay. So a few people are subsidizing the entire economy, which does not make it sustainable. Okay, so investors look at all these parameters and say, this country, we've gone through structural adjustment 1, structural adjustment 2, whatever. The structure of the economy has really not changed.
We have even gone through hippie.
We come back out of hippie. You know, the last IMF that we went through, it wasn't because we didn't know what to do, but it was just policy credibility. We needed a godfather who would hold our hands and tell investors that we are going to ensure that these people will do what they say they are going to do. But all the policies that IMF didn't come up with any new thing, there was no innovation. All the policies that the IMF that was implemented were homegrown solutions that we came up with. And nobody believed us because we didn't have the track record
and the credibility.
And we didn't believe in ourselves either.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to take my final break. When we get back, we will wrap up our conversation. This is the business edition of Premium Express. Welcome back from the break, and we're just in the last leg of our conversation. My guest, Professor Bokpin, economist, and Michael Kobler, Director, Cedi Ghana. And it's time for wrap-up and conclusions on our conversation. Prof. Bokpin, I'll start with you very quickly for us. Everything in perspective, what we should expect, something for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that because the Cedi is a very topical issue, even though it's been discussed a number of times, I believe that the central bank will have to be cautious in terms of how they intervene in the market, because you don't have an unlimited international reserves. So how much you inject and the timing is very important. Okay. So I agree largely. I know there's pressure on them to intervene in terms of market interventions, but there's conventional wisdom in building your international reserve, because next year is a long year and all of that. So you don't want to do it in such a way that it will encourage speculative activity in the market and all of that. But I believe that government has a lot of role to play in all of this. In terms of the early signals are always there, whether government is going to keep to the fiscal discipline. That's very, very important. And I also agree that we want to preserve domestic capital for the private sector. government tends to look to the external market, and especially if we're able to raise the Eurobonds, which we will do anyway. And the risk we are talking about is not the fact that we may not be able to raise the money. The question is at what cost.
Yeah.
Okay. And once all these uncertainties, and I think we will need both the opposition, those in government. Sometimes the negative news really, it doesn't help anybody, whether you are in opposition or you are in government. I think it goes to affect government, because once those negative news heighten, it translates to higher risk. And that higher risk may translate to default. And when investors perceive higher default, then they will seek greater protection by holding out for higher rate. So I'm just hoping that, and maybe I'll call on government and say that, you know what, let's just use next year to prove all of us that,
wrong.
Yes, that, you know what, we will not make the mistakes that we have made in the time past. We will maintain fiscal discipline. Because when you read across the international community and even from the domestic market, the fear is whether government will maintain fiscal discipline.
Okay.
That we will not spend in excess of the projected, we will not do so many off-budget expenditures. And those off-budget expenditures usually do not go to enhance the productive asset of the economy. They are politically motivated.
Okay.
And then also, so many things we do not explore efficiency. We don't have fiscal space. The little we have, let's make sure that we put the little money in the areas that can generate the most benefit for all of us.
Okay. Mike, wrap up, please.
Well,
The things are plenty. I know.
Negative publicity, we should avoid negative publicity. I mean, whoever comes to government in the next term, based on the sentiments that are expressed during the election year, it will have an implication on whether people want to flood money at us or want to come into our economy. Yeah. So the discourse should be about sound ideas and innovative policies that will move the country forward. I think, secondly, we must seek innovative ways of expanding our tax brackets in a manner that a lot more people would contribute to the kitty in terms of revenue. I mentioned the municipal bonds. We must aggressively seek to ensure that we empower our municipalities to be self-financing and more productive. And finally, like Prof said, whatever money little resource that we have, we should deploy it in areas that will be productive. That will generate quantum revenues that will more than offset the debt that we are taking.
Okay.
I think once we do that, we'll be on a sound track to stabilizing the economy.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to say a very big thank you for your time. My guest again, Michael Kobler, Director, Cedi Ghana, and Prof. Brockman, Godfred Brockman, economist, University of Ghana Business School. My name, Philip Nanfuri. This has been the business edition of PM Express. I wish you the very best, and as the Finance Ministry gets ready to issue another Eurobond, I'm sure we'll all be invited to the party that comes after. Have a good night.